Welcome back to the City Lights Collective on WABE. I'm Kim Droves.
And I'm John Good. There's been a lot of chatter lately about proposed budget cuts to the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. But what is the actual impact of these cuts on working artists, arts institutions, and the communities they serve? Who are the human beings whose livelihoods are at risk? City Lights Collective member Kelundra Smith recently spoke with Heather Infantry, CEO of The Giving Gap, to find out.
Heather Infantry, I just want to jump in with you. You know, we have been receiving a lot of information about what's happening with various types of cultural funding, arts funding, federal funding over the last few months. A report was released. According to the Bureau for Economic Analysis, the arts and culture sector employs about 5.4 million people nationwide. Here in Atlanta, the Atlanta Regional Commission has reported that the creative industries employ more than 89,000 people, which is about 3% of the total employment base. The Atlanta region is also home to more than 1,700 cultural nonprofit groups that collectively bring in more than $632 million a year in revenue to our city. Those are a lot of numbers. There are a lot of important numbers, but what do they actually mean? And that's what I want to talk to you about today. We're having this conversation at a moment when Congress has proposed reducing the budget for the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities to $135 million each. This will be taking about $72 million from each of those agencies. And so I'd like to just hear from you, your perspective on the potential impact on these NEA and NEH reductions on nonprofits in Metro Atlanta.
The conversation is definitely an opportunity to bring about some awareness, right? So you brought up the point that many Black organizations don't even get federal funding. Like I did a quick little query to look at what our allotment is for the state of Georgia from the Humanities and from the Arts Endowment. And we get a small percentage, like those of us in the South get a small percentage of national federal funding dollars, both in the public sector and the private sector. So that's an issue and a challenge that we need to become more publicly aware about. And then when you lay a racial lens over that, well, then it's zero, right? There's a small, maybe one or two organizations in Metro Atlanta that are actually benefiting from that kind of federal funding, which begs the question, how have these organizations supported and sustained the work? And what do they need going forward to continue to be able to scale, if scale is of interest, or how has that hindered their ability to scale the work or do more creative, risk-taking, imaginative type of artwork, right? I think the funding ecosystem has definitely created an environment where the art is not always relevant and responsive. That's what happens. You get bad art when you don't adequately support and fund it. And I think that's one of the main fallouts that folks don't necessarily consider, that we're not allowing artists to be what they were intended to be, which is, change makers, commentators on what's happening. They're supposed to be rabble rousers. They're supposed to push boundaries and help us to see the things that we're not seeing.
I see your point. I think that's a hard pill for folks to swallow, especially since earlier this year, there was that executive order rescinding arts funding from places that had already received award letters last fall, right? And so folks who don't work on the inside of like nonprofits or education may not fully understand that like when you get a federal grant, it's usually a form of reimbursement. Right. So, for example, if I have a program where I do art making for youth and I spend, I get a $50,000 NEA or NEH grant for that program. Right. And then I start spending my money because I've gotten my award letter. Well, now I have a $50,000 deficit because my receipts can't be submitted for reimbursement because my award letter is gone. Because to your point, the artistic work that the new guidelines are willing to support has to be things that, according to the executive order, highlight patriotism and align with the America 250 celebrations that are planned for next year. And so I'm just curious for folks who are like in the trenches that are like, where do we go from here? What encouraging words do you have for people who are feeling the overwhelm and the uncertainty right now, especially as someone who has been inventive about the ways in which organizations that have historically and continue to be neglected by major funders are able to access resources?
I think it's an invitation for reinvention. It's broken. The funding model is absolutely broken. Just even the process and approach in which we have to deal with federal funding where we get reimbursed on the back end is insufficient for us to meet the demands of what we are trying to do and execute on a vision. All of it does not accommodate for how art needs to be created and how it then needs to be disseminated, right? The fact that we have grant guidelines that happen at a particular time of the year, but art is moved by inspiration that's sparked by a moment that's happening at a time and place. And so for me to take that spark of inspiration and then wait 6 months on the off chance that you might like this idea that I have and then potentially fund it and then not give me money until I execute on the thing just doesn't accommodate for the way that the work has to happen. And so I do think it's an opportunity for artists and those that support the arts to think about new models.
If you're just tuning in, I'm City Lights Collective member Kelundra Smith, and today I am speaking with Heather Infantry, CEO of The Giving Gap, about the human impact of reductions in nonprofit arts funding. August is Black Philanthropy Month, and The Giving Gap will be hosting an event to amplify local nonprofits at the Gathering Spot on Tuesday, August 19th at 6:30 p.m. In Georgia, we have long struggled with this issue of arts funding, right? This is not a new conversation here. And the pushback that I am often hearing is that, yes, that all sounds well and good, but we live in the context of capitalism, and in capitalism, people pay for what they value. They pay for what matters to them. I know what my thoughts are on that, but I am curious what your thoughts are there. What is your response to the folks who say, well, if it mattered, people would just pay for it unwittingly?
The nonprofit ecosystem has set up a structure in such a way that disconnects us from our patrons and our supporters, who naturally would be our patrons and supporters, right? So they've established themselves as the go-to source for funding, and then all of our energy has been directed to playing that game with them. And then we come up short and we're scrambling, but that's the way you're supposed to do it. And we've neglected the thing that is most intuitive to us, which is the folks that are in our backyard. So I don't think it's that folks aren't willing to pay for it. I think it's just we've lost our ability to connect and make a case with our own community about how to do this. One of the challenges I've always had as a fundraiser, and I've been doing fundraising for 20 plus years, I really don't know how to fundraise without pandering to white liberal guilt. That's kind of like how I was taught to do it. I was taught that you present a case that positions the beneficiaries of your program in the most negative of light, right? You're naming all the disadvantages and deficits that they have so that you appeal to this emotional tug string that you're trying to make, and then that gets the money. And that's inefficient because people feel for a moment and then they move on. That's not sustainable. And so, as a fundraiser, that was like sort of the core approach that we took. And now moving forward, working with Giving Gap, trying to figure out how best to appeal, not from a place of disadvantage, but how do we create an opportunity that is invitational, where everybody is excited and interested in supporting something, correcting a past wrong, and moving forward into the future collectively, knowing that it benefits everybody, not just the folks that are core to this mission, but that when we advance, for example, like we're trying to bridge the racial equity gap in giving, but when we support Black nonprofits doing work in the community, it makes all communities better. We're all better for it. And trying to make that case, the sort of nonprofit ecosystem, business model, tax write-off strategy, which at the end of the day is an advantage to the wealthy, is not necessarily core to serving community need, because if it was, how do we have all of these funds and then such a huge gap in community? how is the business that you are leading, said funder, said donor, to give money away to those most in need? And then those most in need just aren't getting the money.
Well, you hit on something that I think is super important. I often say the community you build will be the audience that you have. I remember I started my career in community engagement, doing community engagement for art galleries and for theaters. And I always say, well, let's look for who's not here, right? Because everybody's going to the same wells for water, right?
Right.
And so who's not in the room? Who are the uninvited folks? I am a big believer like you that times of tremendous change make way for us to get creative. And I'd like to hear how you believe arts organizations can get creative during this time.
Yeah, I'm really interested in collaboration in really meaningful kind of ways. Like, what would it look like to share resources, like really share resources? One of the things that we're doing with our Giving Gap Black Philanthropy Month event in a couple of weeks is we're launching a SUSU campaign type model where we're asking nonprofit organizations to contribute to a fund and then the collective community to sort of match and amplify those dollars. But we're all like contributing and then sharing those resources equally among the nonprofits benefiting. Like, what would it look like to go back to some traditional models like a SUSU and use it to benefit each other? What would it look like, in addition to sharing, staffing, sharing physical space? And maybe it's a cross discipline. Like, what would it look like for an arts organization to pair up with a healthcare institution or an education institution and be sort of like a cohort trying to work through and navigate the different expenses and overhead needs that they have that they could then streamline together?
I would like for you to talk to us about how you are going to be activating imaginations on Tuesday, August 19th at 6:30 at the Gathering Spot with this event as a part of Black Philanthropy Month. What can folks expect?
So we've been working over the last 6 months with a local production company to put together some content. We have gotten into the filming space, looking to comedy and satire to poke a little fun at our sector. It's absurd. It's funny at times. And so we wanted to bring some levity, but at the same time, issuing a charge to our community around some of these things that we've talked about. Like, what does it look like for us to lean on ourselves and to do for ourselves and not play in the sandbox anymore with some of these funders that have been a challenge to our progress? And so the event will kick off with a screening of some of this material that we're putting under the auspices of Giving Gap TV. You'll have an opportunity to hear from the 6 organizations that we're spotlighting. The African Diasporic Art Museum of Atlanta, DAMA is one of the organizations, Artful ATL, True Colors Theater Company, LEAD, She Soars, and Planned to AT are all benefiting from that event.
That is an exciting lineup, and no doubt the Gathering Spot will be the place to be on August 19th at 6:30. For more details about the Giving Gap and for the latest news on arts funding in Metro Atlanta and beyond, visit wabe.org/citylights. Thank you, Heather Infantry, for speaking with me.
Thanks, Kelundra. It was great meeting you.